In a cellar that has not seen the sun for 20 years, a twisted scholar dares Al-Baari himself, kneading blood, rot and mercury into a screaming lump of life. It crawls from the vessel blind, yet somehow it already knows whose warmth to hunt. In the sweltering heat of the year 855, the round city of Baghdad was the glorious, beating heart of the world, a jewel where scholars traded philosophy like silk and astronomers mapped the heavens with the precision of diamond cutters. Yet, if you peeled back the golden veneer of the Abbasid Caliphate, past the marble columns of the House of Wisdom and away from the perfumed gardens of the elite, you would find a darker, more visceral reality festering in the shadows. It was here, in the labyrinthine alleyways of the ward of the paper sellers, that the air smelled not of jasmine and rosewater, but of curing leather, iron gall ink, and the copper tang of butcher's blood baking on the cobblestones. And it was here, deep beneath the street level, in a cellar that had not seen the light of the sun in 20 years, that a man named Abu Uthman Amr ibn Bar al-Kinani, known to history simply as Al-Jaiz, was conducting an experiment that would damn his soul for eternity. Al-Jaiz was a giant of intellect, a man whose mind was a razor capable of dissecting the most complex theologies, but his physical form was a source of constant torment. His name, Al-Jaiz, literally meant the bug-eyed, a cruel moniker mocking the protruding eyes that seemed to strain against his skull as if trying to escape the prison of his own flesh. While the world praised him for his treatises on rhetoric and biology, for his book of animals which catalogued the natural world with obsessive detail, in private, he had grown to despise the natural order. He had spent decades studying the attribute of Al-Baari, the maker, the divine evolver who creates form from nothingness, who distinguishes the bone from the marrow and the vein from the muscle without a blueprint. Al-Jaiz was no longer content to merely observe the work of God, he was consumed by a hubris tic, venomous envy that gnawed at his sanity like a rat chewing through a grain sack. He believed that the secret of life was not a divine mystery locked away in the seventh heaven, but a chemical formula, a precise and manipulatable balance of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that could be replicated by human hands if one possessed the courage to transgress the ultimate boundary. The cellar was his temple of blasphemy, a stifling, windowless chamber illuminated only by the sputtering grease of 3 iron lamps that cast long, dancing shadows against the damp brickwork. The room was cluttered with the debris of a madman's obsession, stacks of vellum scrolls detailing the forbidden alchemy of takwin, the artificial generation of life, lay scattered among glass alembics, crushing mortars, and jars containing things that should have been buried. There were jars of river mud from the Tigris harvested at the exact moment of the spring flood, vials of mercury that shimmered with a toxic allure, and dried organs of animals that had been slaughtered according to pagan rituals long forgotten by the pious men above. Al-Jaiz moved through this gloom with a feverish energy, his bulging eyes wide and unblinking, his hands trembling not with age, but with the terrifying thrill of a man about to pry open the ribcage of the universe. He was preparing for the final mixture, convinced that he had corrected the errors of the ancients, convinced that he alone, a deformed scholar in a dark basement, could usurp the name of Al-Baari and sculpt a living, breathing soul from dead matter. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a sleeve stained by sulfur and soot, muttering calculations under his breath, unaware that the silence of the room was gathering around him, heavy and expectant, waiting for the moment the first line would be crossed. The preparation of the vessel required a steadiness of hand that betrayed the chaotic fervor of Al-Jaiz's mind, for the glass he had commissioned was blown from the sands of the Euphrates and tempered in ash, fragile as a promise and clear as a sinner's tear. Into this bulbous womb, known to the Hermetic circles as the philosophical egg, he began to introduce the agents of generation with a ritualistic slowness that bordered on the obscene. He did not merely pour, he violated the sanctity of the empty space. First came the heavy, silver fluid of quicksilver, the soul of the metal, shivering at the bottom of the glass like a trapped spirit, followed by the yellow, choking dust of sulfur to provide the masculine heat, the active force that would impregnate the cold mercury. But these were merely the lifeless minerals of the earth, the bones of the operation, and Al-Jaiz knew that to invoke the specific power of Al-Baari, to compel the clay to rise and breathe, he required the sanguinary spark of the living. With a grimace that contorted his already bulging features, He unstoppered a clay jar that had been kept warm in a bed of horse manure, releasing a stench so thick it seemed to coat the back of the throat with a layer of grease. It contained the putrefied blood of a goat slaughtered during the new moon, mixed with the seminal fluid collected from men who had died in states of extreme terror, a horrific slurry believed by the darker alchemists to contain the trapped, frantic energy of the soul desperately trying to remain in the mortal realm. He poured this visceral cocktail into the alembic, watching the liquids collide and swirl in a violent, oily suspension, the red and the white and the silver refusing to merge, warring against one another like enemies in a pit. The mixture hissed, not with the sound of chemistry, but with the wet, sputtering gasp of a drowning thing, sending up plumes of vapor that twisted into shapes suggestive of screaming faces before dissolving against the cool glass. Al-Jaiz then sealed the neck of the vessel with the lute of wisdom, a thick paste made of clay, hair, and dung, ensuring that not a single breath of the reaction could escape, for the text of the emerald tablet warned that the spirit, once generated, would seek any fissure to flee back to the ether. He placed the sealed vessel into the athanor, the slow-burning furnace he had constructed from firebrick and iron, adjusting the drafts to maintain a temperature exactly that of a brooding hen, a heat gentle enough to coax life but fierce enough to cook the corruption into purity. Now began the period of the blackening, the nigredo, the long and agonizing vigil of putrefaction where the ingredients had to rot and die before they could be reborn. For 40 days and 40 nights, a biblical span of trial and isolation, Al-Jaiz did not leave the cellar, nor did he allow the fire to waver by even a single degree. He became a specter in his own home, his robes stiff with sweat and soot, his skin turning the color of old parchment as he inhaled the fumes that inevitably wept through the pores of the clay seal. The air in the cellar grew heavy and oppressive, charged with a static energy that made the hair on his arms stand erect, as if the atmosphere itself was recoiling from the abomination brewing within the glass. He stopped eating the food his servants left at the top of the stairs, sustaining himself only on stagnant water and the manic energy of his obsession, his eyes fixed on the swirling darkness inside the vessel. At first, the mixture turned a chaotic black, a bubbling tar that seemed to absorb the light of the lamps, but as the second week bled into the third, strange and terrifying phenomena began to manifest. The black mass began to separate, organizing itself not through the laws of gravity, but through a perverse internal will. Veins of white, fibrous material began to web through the sludge, pulsing with a rhythmic contraction that mimicked the beating of a rudimentary heart. Al-Jaiz watched, trembling, as the chaotic soup began to curdle into solid matter, witnessing the very act of differentiation that was the sole province of the Creator. He saw shapes forming in the gloom of the glass, a knot of gristle here, a stretch of translucent membrane there, all of it floating in a suspension of amber fluid that glowed with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. It was a sight that should have evoked wonder, but instead, it provoked a deep, primal nausea, a biological rejection of what was happening. This was not the clean, geometric unfolding of a flower or the noble growth of an embryo in the womb. This was a forced, cancerous aggregation of meat, a violent assembling of parts that had no business existing together. The silence of the cellar was no longer silent, it was filled with the wet, slapping sounds of the matter inside the glass colliding with the walls of its prison, a sound like a wet towel striking a stone floor, repetitive and mindless. By the 39th night, the heat in the room had become unbearable, a physical weight that pressed against Al-Jaiz's chest, making every breath a labor. He sat hunched before the athanor, his face illuminated by the red glow of the coals, watching as the thing inside the glass finally coalesced into a single, unified mass. It was no longer a liquid, it was a solid, heaving lump of flesh, roughly the size of a human infant but lacking the sanctity of human form. It pressed itself against the glass, and for the first time, Al-Jaiz saw the texture of his creation, wet, porous, and raw, like a burn victim stripped of skin. He realized with a jolt of ice-cold terror that he had succeeded in the mechanics but failed in the design. He had invoked the power of growth, the power of Al-Baari, but he had provided no blueprint for the soul, no template for the form. He had created raw life, unguided and unchained, and as the 40th day dawned, the thing inside the glass stopped its aimless swirling and seemed to orient itself, pressing what might have been a face against the transparent barrier, waiting for its father to break the seal. The expiration of the 40th night arrived not with a celestial fanfare or the trumpet of an angel, but with a silence so profound it felt as though the cellar had been severed from the earth and cast adrift into the void between stars. The fire in the Athanor had burned down to a bed of sullen, glowing embers, casting a bruised and bloody light across the stone floor, painting the laboratory in shades of rust and dried gore. Al-Jaiz stood before the vessel, his body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and a terrible, electric anticipation that made his teeth chatter in his skull. The glass, once clear, was now clouded with the greasy residue of the transformation, a fog of condensation that obscured the horror within, though the sound of its movement, a wet, slithering friction against the walls of the philosophical egg, was louder than the pounding of his own heart. He held in his hand a small iron hammer, the handle slick with the sweat of his palms, and a chisel of cold steel, tools of the mason that were now to become the instruments of a midwife to a monstrosity. He knew, with the certainty of a man who has stared too long into the abyss, that the time for hesitation had passed. The texts of the ancients, specifically the obscure commentaries on the Book of Stones, dictated that the homunculus must be birthed at the precise hour of the planetary alignment, or else the spirit, the ruh, would fail to adhere to the flesh, leaving only a husk of mindless meat. With a prayer that strangled in his throat before it could reach his lips, Al-Jaiz struck the seal. The sound was sharp, a violent crack that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space, and the hardened paste of clay and dung fractured, falling away in jagged shards to reveal the lip of the vessel. Immediately, a sound escaped the breach, a hiss of pressurized gas that carried with it a stench so foul, so aggressively malignant, that Al-Jaiz gagged and stumbled back, his eyes watering as if he had been sprayed with venom. It was not merely the smell of rot, for rot is a natural part of the cycle of life, the earth reclaiming its own. This was the scent of something that had never been meant to exist, a chemical blasphemy of burning hair, sulfur, and the sweet, cloying odor of old blood that has turned black in the sun. It was the smell of a mistake. Covering his mouth with the sleeve of his robe, he forced himself to step forward, to look into the mouth of the glass womb he had tended with such obsessive care. He tilted the alembic, his muscles straining against the weight of the thick glass and the heavy, shifting mass inside, and with a wet, sickening plop that sounded like a butcher throwing a slab of liver onto a wooden block, the contents slid out onto the cold flagstones of the cellar floor. For a long, agonizing moment, the thing lay motionless in a pool of viscous, amber slime, a heap of raw and glistening matter that steamed in the cool air of the basement. Al-Jaiz leaned over it, raising the oil lamp with a shaking hand to banish the shadows, and as the light fell upon his creation, a scream built in his chest that he had no breath to release. The creature was a nightmare of anatomy, a chaotic assemblage of features that mocked the divine symmetry of the human form. It was roughly the size of a 2-year-old child, but there the resemblance ended and the horror began. Its skin was not the opaque, protective hide of a man or a beast, but a translucent, gelatinous membrane, shockingly thin and wet, through which Al-Jaiz could see the frantic pulsing of purple veins and the white, ropey cords of muscle twitching with galvanic spasms. It had no face, not in any way that a sanity-preserving mind could recognize. Where a nose should have been, there were 2 vertical slits that flared and collapsed with ragged, desperate breaths, and its mouth was a circular, lipless orifice filled with rows of needle-like ridges of bone, gaping open to emit a low, continuous mewling sound that grated against the nerves like a saw on bone. But it was the eyes that broke Al-Jaiz's spirit. The creature had not 2 eyes, but 3, clustered together in the center of its misshapen forehead, lidless and weeping a thick, milky fluid. They were not the eyes of a newborn, full of potential and light, they were the eyes of something ancient and suffering, rolling independently in their sockets, devoid of the iris or pupil, just spheres of clouded white that seemed to stare into a dimension of pain that only they could perceive. The creature began to move, not with the coordinated grace of a living thing, but with the jerky, broken motions of a marionette whose strings are being pulled by a madman. It dragged itself across the stones, its limbs disproportionately long and ending in clusters of fingers that numbered 7 on one hand and 3 on the other, clutching at the floor with a grip that scraped fingernails against rock. It was seeking heat, seeking the warmth of the dying furnace, driven by a biological imperative that bypassed thought or emotion. Al-Jaiz watched in paralyzed horror as the thing he had sought to fashion in the image of the divine Al-Baari writhed in the dirt, a testament to his own arrogance. He had sought to create a man, a vessel for wisdom and purity, but he had forgotten that only God can weave the spirit into the clay. He had built a house of flesh, but because he could not command the angels to dwell within it, something else had taken up residence, something primal, broken, and agonizingly alive. The creature paused in its dragging, lifting its heavy, hydrocephalic head, and those three milky eyes seemed to lock onto the heat of Al-Jaiz's body. The mewling sound rose in pitch, becoming a shrill, demanding shriek that pierced the silence of the cellar, a cry of pure, unadulterated hunger that had nothing to do with the need for milk or bread, but a hunger for the vitality it lacked, a parasitic need to consume the life it had been denied. Al-Jaiz realized then, with a clarity that froze his blood, that he was not the master of this room, he was the prey in a cage of his own making, locked in the dark with a sin that could breathe. The creature's skin steamed as it dragged its raw belly over the rough stones, leaving a trail of caustic slime that hissed faintly where it touched the ground, and with a sudden, convulsive lurch, it began to pull itself not toward the fire, but toward him. The terror that gripped Al-Jaiz was not merely the instinctual fear of a man cornered by a predator, but the profound, metaphysical vertigo of a theologian who has peered behind the veil of creation and found only a void where God should be. As the creature dragged its wet, glistening bulk across the flagstones, the sound of its movement was a wet slap and a friction-filled slide, like a heavy sack of wet leather being pulled over gravel. Al-Jaiz backed away, his heels scraping against the rough stone floor until his spine collided with the cold, unforgiving wood of his library shelves, the scrolls of ancient wisdom tumbling down around him like dead leaves, useless and mocking in the face of this living abomination. He scrambled for a weapon, his hand closing around the heavy iron fire poker that rested against the athanor, the metal cold and pitted with rust, a crude instrument of violence for a man whose life had been dedicated to the ink and the quill. The creature paused in its advance, its three milk-white eyes rolling independently in their sockets, seemingly unable to focus on a single point in space, yet Al-Jaiz felt the weight of their gaze pressing upon him, a sensory pressure that made the skin on his face prickle and itch. It was the gaze of a thing that possessed the nafs, the base animal soul of desire and hunger, but lacked the aql, the intellect that elevates man above the beast, and was entirely void of the ruh, the divine breath that grants moral agency. It was a biological machine, a collection of organs and impulses that had been stitched together by the arrogance of a mortal who thought he could wear the mantle of Al-Baari, the evolver, without burning his hands. The smell in the room had shifted from the sharp tang of chemical birth to something far more cloying and earthy, a scent reminiscent of a butcher's shop that had been left open in the heat of a Baghdad summer, a mix of copper blood and souring meat that made the bile rise in Al-Jaiz's throat. He watched, mesmerized by his own revulsion, as the creature raised a hand, if such a twisted appendage could be called a hand, and pressed it against the cold stone of the floor. The limb had too many joints, bending in places where bone should be rigid, and the fingers were webbed with a thick, translucent skin that pulsed with the rapid, frantic rhythm of the violet blood pumping beneath. Al-Jaiz, his voice trembling with the fragile hope of a scholar who believes that reason can conquer all, even the irrational, whispered the names of God, hoping that the sacred syllables might act as a barrier or a command. He spoke the name Al-Khaliq, the Creator, and Al-Musawwir, the Shaper of Beauty, but the words fell dead in the heavy, stagnant air of the cellar. The creature did not recoil, it did not hiss, it merely tilted its hydrocephalic head to the side, the fluid inside its skull audibly sloshing, observing him with a blank, insectal curiosity. It had no concept of the divine because it was a thing born of earth and fire alone, severed from the celestial hierarchy. It opened its mouth, that circular, lipless maw filled with needle ridges of calcified cartilage, and let out a sound that froze the marrow in Al-Jaiz's bones. It was not a roar, nor a growl, but a mimicry. It was a distorted, grinding repetition of the friction sound Al-Jaiz's sandals had made against the floor, a perfect, hollow echo of the sound of fear, played back by a throat that had never learned to speak. The creature was learning, absorbing the sensory data of its environment with a terrifying speed, not to understand, but to adapt. It lurched forward again, this time with a sudden, convulsive speed that belied its clumsy appearance, covering half the distance between them in a single, wet surge. Al-Jaiz shouted, a primal sound of warning, and swung the iron poker with all the hysterical strength of his panic. The metal struck the creature's shoulder with a sickening thud, sinking into the soft, gelatinous flesh without meeting the resistance of solid bone. But there was no scream of pain, no recoil of shock. The creature simply absorbed the blow, its flesh closing around the iron rod like wet dough swallowing a stone. Al-Jaiz tried to pull the weapon back, but the creature's muscles, visible through the translucent skin, clamped down on the metal with hydraulic force. He stared in horror as the skin around the impact site began to bubble and knit together in real time, the rapid cellular division he had engineered to create life now working to protect the monster, healing the wound in a matter of seconds with a wet, knitting sound. This was the dark side of the attribute of Al-Baari. He had sought to create a being that could evolve and adapt, and he had succeeded too well. He had created a cancer-given form, a thing that knew only growth and consumption. The creature yanked the poker from his grip with a casual twitch of its shoulder, sending the iron clattering into the shadows, and then it reached out. Its touch was the most horrifying part of all. When its wet, seven-fingered hand grazed the hem of Al-Jaiz's linen robe, he did not feel heat or cold, but a sudden, draining void, as if the creature was a sponge soaking up the ambient thermal energy of the room. The fabric where it touched him turned gray and brittle instantly, crumbling into dust as if aged 1,000 years in a heartbeat. Al-Jaiz realized with a jolt of understanding that nearly stopped his heart that the creature was not self-sustaining. The alchemical fire he had used to bake it was fading, it was a metabolic furnace that burned through energy at a catastrophic rate. It was starving, not for meat or bread, but for the harara, the vital heat that resides in living things. It was an energy vampire, a leech of life force that would consume everything around it to fuel its own chaotic biology. He kicked out, his foot connecting with the creature's chest, feeling the disturbing squish of organs shifting under the thin membrane, and scrambled sideways, knocking over a rack of drying herbs that sent a cloud of dust and dried leaves into the air. The creature sneezed, a human sound, stolen from the world above, and whipped its head around, the three milky eyes locking onto him again with renewed intensity. It was no longer just curious, it was predatory. The sluggishness of its birth was wearing off, replaced by a jittery, twitching energy as its metabolism spiked. Al-Jaiz ran to the heavy wooden table where his journals lay, putting the furniture between him and the beast, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. He looked at the door at the top of the stone stairs, the only exit, but the creature was positioned between him and salvation, its body heaving, its skin beginning to dry and crack in the ambient air, weeping a clear, sticky serum that smelled of ammonia. It needed his fluids, it needed his heat. It began to circle the table, mirroring his movements with a terrifying intelligence that was purely tactical. When he moved left, it moved right, cutting off his angle, its movements becoming more fluid, less jerky, as it calibrated its own limbs. Al-Jaiz grabbed a heavy glass jar filled with vitriol, sulfuric acid, one of the many dangerous reagents he had used in his folly. He uncorked it, his hands shaking so violently that the corrosive liquid splashed onto his own fingers, stinging like the bite of a scorpion, but he barely felt it. He hurled the contents at the creature. The acid struck the beast full in the face, sizzling as it hit the wet membrane. Smoke rose from its flesh, and the creature shrieked, a sound that was not mimicry this time, but a genuine, high-pitched frequency that shattered the glass of the nearby alembics. It thrashed blindly, clawing at its melting face, the acid eating into the delicate tissues of its eyes. But even as the flesh dissolved, Al-Jaiz saw the pink, granulation tissue already forming underneath, the cells regenerating with a frantic, aggressive speed that defied nature. The injury only angered it, it did not disable it. It lunged blindly across the table, smashing through the wood as if it were rotten balsa, its claws raking the air inches from Al-Jaiz's chest. He stumbled back, tripping over his own robes, and fell hard onto the stone floor, the wind knocked out of him. He looked up to see the creature looming over him, its face a ruin of melting jelly and regenerating bone, its 3 eyes clouded and burning but still fixed on his heat signature. It did not strike immediately. It lowered itself slowly, hovering over him like a shroud, and Al-Jaiz could feel the intense cold radiating from its body, a chill that seemed to suck the warmth right out of the air. It was a vacuum of life. It opened its mouth, and a drop of thick, viscous saliva landed on Al-Jaiz's cheek, burning like ice. In that moment of absolute helplessness, lying in the filth of his own laboratory, Al-Jaiz looked into the abyss he had summoned. He saw no universe, no stars, no wisdom. He saw only the endless, hungry dark. He realized that the name of Al-Baari was not a password to power, but a seal on a door that was never meant to be opened by human hands. He had thought to be a god, but he was merely a meal. The creature's hand, now healing from the acid but scarred and twisted, reached down, not to strike, but to caress his face. The touch was agonizing, a sensation of thousands of microscopic needles drawing the warmth from his blood. Al-Jaiz tried to scream, to beg, to pray, but his voice was paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of the creature's presence. It whispered to him then, a sound that came from its throat but used his own voice, stolen and distorted, saying the only words it had heard him speak in the darkness of its gestation. It leaned close, its breath smelling of grave dirt and sulfur, and rasped, "Evolver. Evolver." Mocking his ambition with the very title he had sought to steal. The irony was a sharper blade than any knife. He had evolved matter, yes, but he had evolved it into a perfect predator, and he was the only prey in the room. The shadows of the cellar seemed to stretch and wrap around them, the flickering oil lamps dying one by one as if the creature's presence was consuming the very light itself, leaving them in a growing darkness where the only sound was the wet, rhythmic breathing of the thing and the terrified hammering of Al-Jaiz's heart. He knew that if the light failed completely, if the darkness took them, he would never see the sun of Baghdad again. He had to act, he had to destroy it, or he would become part of it, fuel for its impossible, blasphemous existence. With the last reserve of his strength, fueled by the adrenaline of the dying, he groped blindly on the floor for a shard of the broken glass alembic, his fingers closing around a jagged, razor-sharp piece of the very vessel that had birthed this nightmare. With the desperation of a man already dead, Al-Jaiz drove the jagged shard of glass into the pulsing, translucent throat of the abomination, the force of the blow driven by a lifetime of regret compressed into a single, violent second. The glass, thick and curved from the belly of the alembic, shore through the wet membrane of the creature's neck with a sound like tearing silk, plunging deep into the wet, dark machinery of its throat. A geyser of black, viscous fluid erupted from the wound, spraying across Al-Jaiz's face, blinding him with a substance that tasted of copper and old, stagnant water, burning his skin with a chemical heat that felt less like blood and more like acid. The creature threw its head back, its 3 milky eyes widening in a spasm of shock, and released a sound that was no longer a mimicry of the human voice but a resonant, hollow booming that seemed to vibrate the very stones of the cellar foundation. It was the sound of the earth itself groaning in protest at the violation of its laws. The beast thrashed, its 7-fingered hand releasing its grip on Al-Jaiz's robe, and the scholar scrambled backward, his heels slipping in the slick pool of the creature's ichor, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps that tore at his lungs. He wiped the blinding slime from his eyes, his vision blurring and swimming in the gloom, only to witness a sight that shattered the last remnants of his rational mind. The creature was not dying, it was not bleeding out in the way a natural animal would, for it possessed no heart to stop, no singular vessel of life to drain. Instead, the wound around the glass shard was already reacting with a terrifying, aggressive biological purpose. The flesh bubbled and frothed, turning from a pale, sickly white to a bruised purple as the cells multiplied at a rate visible to the naked eye, knitting together around the foreign object, swallowing the glass into its own mass. The creature was absorbing the weapon, integrating the silica into its own structure, just as it had sought to absorb Al-Jaiz's heat. It reached up with a hand that was now trembling not with weakness but with a surplus of chaotic energy, and gripped the protruding end of the glass shard, ripping it from its own neck with a wet, sucking pop that sent a fresh spray of black fluid across the room. The creature held the bloody shard for a moment, tilting its head, its intellect evolving with every passing second of trauma, realizing that objects could be tools, that matter could be weaponized. It looked at Al-Jaiz, and in that gaze, the scholar saw the dawn of malice, the birth of cruelty in a being that had known only hunger. The cellar, once a sanctuary of silence and study, had become an arena of damnation. Al-Jaiz scrambled to his feet, his limbs heavy with the unnatural cold that still radiated from the beast, and lunged toward the heavy oak table where his oil lamp still flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock his plight. He needed fire, not the gentle warmth of the Athanor that had incubated this sin, but a destructive, purging fire that could cleanse the world of his mistake. He grabbed a heavy clay amphora filled with refined lamp oil, a fuel he had used to keep his nights of study bright, and hurled it with all his might at the creature. The clay vessel shattered against the monster's chest, drenching it in the fragrant, flammable liquid, the oil mixing with the black ichor to create a slick, glistening sheen over its misshapen body. The creature hissed, a sound of irritation, and stepped forward, the glass shard still clutched in its hand like a dagger. Al-Jaiz did not hesitate, he grabbed the nearest iron lamp, the flame dancing wildly at the wick, and threw it onto the oil-soaked floor at the beast's feet. The ignition was instantaneous and violent. A wall of orange and blue flame roared to life, separating the creator from the created, the heat hitting Al-Jaiz with the force of a physical blow, singing his eyebrows and drying the sweat on his forehead in an instant. The sudden inferno illuminated the cellar with the brightness of the noonday sun, revealing the full, grotesque detail of the laboratory, the shelves of rotting organic matter, the jars of preserved deformities, and the creature itself, which now stood silhouetted against the fire like a demon rising from the pit of Jahannam. For a moment, the beast recoiled, the primal fear of fire overriding its predatory drive, its skin blistering and popping as the flames licked at its legs. It shrieked, a high, piercing sound that shattered the remaining glassware on the shelves, sending a rain of crystal shards down onto the stone floor. But then, the horror deepened. As Al-Jaiz watched, backing away toward the stone stairs that led to the safety of the street, he saw the creature's adaptation kick in with a speed that defied all logic. The blisters on its skin did not fester, they hardened. The wet, mucous membrane that covered its body began to dry and crust over, forming a thick, calloused armor of blackened tissue that insulated it from the heat. It was evolving to survive the environment, turning the damage of the fire into a defense mechanism. It stepped through the wall of flames, the fire wreathed around its limbs like a cloak, its three eyes narrowing against the glare but fixed unerringly on Al-Jaiz. It was no longer afraid, it had learned that pain was merely a signal to change, to become harder, stronger, deadlier. Al-Jaiz turned and ran, his sandals slapping against the stone steps, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs, his fingers fumbling with the iron latch, his mind screaming for the cool air of the Baghdad night, for the sound of the call to prayer, for anything that belonged to the world of sanity. But the latch was jammed, rusted shut by the dampness of the cellar or perhaps held fast by the will of a god who demanded he face his judgment. He threw his shoulder against the wood, once, twice, screaming for help, but the thick oak held firm, deaf to his pleas. Below him, the fire was spreading, consuming the table, the shelves, and the stacks of vellum scrolls that contained the sum of his life's work. The Book of Animals, the treatises on rhetoric, the translations of Aristotle, all of it was curling into ash, the wisdom of the world becoming fuel for the incinerator. And rising through the smoke, climbing the stairs with a slow, inexorable gait, was the creature. It was changing again. The stress of the fire and the physical exertion had forced its body to elongate, its limbs stretching and snapping into new configurations. It no longer crawled, it walked upright, its spine straightening with sickening cracks as vertebrae fused and aligned. It was becoming humanoid, a mockery of the man who had made it. Its face, once a featureless blur of cartilage, was beginning to take on a terrifying familiarity. The skin around the mouth was pulling back to reveal teeth that were becoming less needle-like and more square, more human, though still too many and too sharp. The nose was forming a bridge, the chin sharpening. Al-Jaiz stared down into the smoke-filled stairwell, paralyzed by a recognition that froze his blood colder than the creature's touch ever could. The beast was not just evolving, it was mimicking him. It was taking his shape. It was as if the universe was holding up a mirror to his soul, showing him that the monster was not a separate entity, but an extension of his own ego, his own hubris made flesh. The creature stopped halfway up the stairs, the flames roaring below it, casting it in a demonic underlighting. It opened its mouth, and this time, it spoke. It did not mimic a sound, it spoke a word, clear and distinct, in a voice that was Al-Jaiz's own, stripped of all warmth and humanity. "Father," it said, the word dripping with a sarcasm that felt ancient and cold. "Why do you flee from your own perfection?" The psychological weight of the question crushed Al-Jaiz against the door. He had wanted to play God, to be Al-Baari, the Maker, and now his creation was demanding the love and submission that a creation owes its creator, a debt Al-Jaiz could not pay. The cellar was now a furnace, the heat becoming unbearable, the smoke thickening into a suffocating blanket that stung the eyes and filled the throat with soot. The chemicals from the shattered jars, mercury, sulfur, vitriol, were vaporizing, adding a toxic, hallucinogenic quality to the air. Al-Jaiz felt his knees give way, his strength sapped by the lack of oxygen and the overwhelming terror. He slid down the door, sitting on the top step, trapping himself between the unyielding wood and the ascending horror. The creature resumed its climb, heavy footfalls shaking the wooden staircase. It was huge now, towering over him, its skin a patchwork of burned scars and fresh, pink armor, its 3 eyes now glowing with an internal luminescence that cut through the gloom. It reached the top step and loomed over Al-Jaiz, blocking out the light of the fire below. It did not strike him. It did not bite. It simply stood there, radiating that terrible, entropy-inducing cold, acting as a heat sink that drew the very life from the air around it. Al-Jaiz felt his extremities going numb, the frost creeping up his fingers and toes despite the raging fire just feet away. The creature reached out a hand that now looked almost exactly like Al-Jaiz's own, save for the blackened, claw-like nails, and grasped the scholar's chin, forcing him to look up. "You sought the secret of life," the creature whispered, its face inches from his, the smell of burnt meat and ozone overpowering. "You sought to know how the clay rises. Now you shall know. We are the same, you and I. I am the vessel, and you are the filler. I am the hunger, and you are the feast." Al-Jaiz closed his eyes, tears squeezing out to mix with the soot on his face, muttering the Shahada, the declaration of faith, trying to reclaim his soul in the final moments. But the creature laughed, a dry, rasping sound like dead leaves skittering on stone. "There is no God here," it hissed. "Only us. Only the Maker and the Made." The fire below reached the casks of pure ethanol Al-Jaiz had stored for the preservation of specimens, and the cellar detonated. A shockwave of heat and pressure slammed into the staircase, blowing the wooden steps apart in a shower of splinters and sparks. The structure collapsed, sending both Al-Jaiz and the monster tumbling down into the heart of the inferno. They fell through the air, locked in a grotesque embrace, the Creator and his sin plummeting into the red, roaring mouth of the furnace. Al-Jaiz hit the stone floor hard, the breath driven from his body, the heat instantly searing his skin. He rolled, coughing, his robes catching fire, frantically patting them out with blistered hands. He looked up through the wall of flame and saw the creature standing amidst the wreckage of the stairs, unbirthed by the fire, unharmed, seemingly fueled by the destruction. It was growing larger still, expanding with the heat, its shadow stretching across the burning walls like a titan. The ceiling of the cellar began to groan, the wooden beams that supported the street above weakening under the intensity of the blaze. Dust and mortar began to rain down, signaling the imminent collapse of the world above. Al-Jaiz realized with a sudden, calm clarity that there was no escape for his body. The only thing left to save was the truth. He crawled toward a section of the wall where a small ventilation grate, barely the width of a hand, led to the street level, too small for a man, too small for the monster, but perhaps large enough for a voice. He pressed his face to the cool iron of the grate, inhaling the sweet, fresh air of the night, and began to scream, not for help, but a warning. He screamed the truth of what he had done, screaming to the paper sellers and the night watchmen who might be gathering above, drawn by the smoke. He screamed that he was not a martyr, but a criminal, that the thing in the cellar was not a demon from hell, but a demon from the mind of a man who thought he could outdo God. Behind him, the creature roared, a sound of triumph and fury, and the heavy footsteps crunched over the broken glass and burning scrolls, closing the distance for the final act of this tragedy. The heat was so intense now that the gold leaf on his manuscripts was melting, running in liquid rivulets across the stones, a river of molten greed flowing toward the drain. Al-Jaiz turned his back to the grate, facing the fire, facing the monster that now towered 10 feet tall, a colossus of burnt flesh and exposed muscle, and prepared to meet the consequence of his curiosity. The creature raised both fists, like hammers of judgment, and the ceiling beams gave a final, agonizing crack, the weight of the city above ready to crush the sin below. The collapse of the cellar was not a singular event but a cascading failure of structure and reality, a deafening roar that sounded less like the breaking of wood and stone and more like the snapping of the world's own spine. The massive beams of cedar, imported from the mountains of Lebanon and seasoned by decades of dry Baghdad heat, gave way under the impossible thermal stress of the alchemical fire, bringing down the ceiling and the entire contents of the library above in a crushing avalanche of scholarship and masonry. Thousands of scrolls, leather-bound tomes, and heavy stacks of parchment, the accumulated wisdom of the Greeks, the Persians, and the Arabs, rained down into the inferno, instantly transforming from vessels of knowledge into fuel for the beast. Al-Jaiz was pinned to the floor, not by the creature, but by the very weight of his obsession, a massive shelving unit, laden with the heavy, brass-bound volumes of his unfinished encyclopedias, crashed across his legs, shattering his femurs with the wet crunch of celery stalks. He could not scream, for the air had been sucked out of the room by the vacuum of the fire, replaced by a superheated gas that seared the lining of his throat and turned his lungs into bags of ash. He lay there, trapped in the red-hot ruins, staring up through the smoke as the creature, the unholy son of his intellect, stood amidst the falling debris like a titan of the old myths, untouched by the crushing weight, unbothered by the flames that now licked at the ceiling of the night sky. The creature did not flee the destruction, it embraced it. The heat that was killing Al-Jaiz was feeding the monster, its metabolism accelerating to a point of singularity where biology became physics. The black, calloused armor of its skin glowed with a dull, cherry-red incandescence, absorbing the thermal energy of the burning library, growing larger, denser, and more terrible with every second. It looked down at its creator, pinned and broken beneath the burning literature, and in that moment, the tragedy of Al-Jaiz was complete. He was being buried by the very books he had written to explain the world, while the thing that defied all explanation stood over him, a living refutation of every word he had ever penned. The beast slowly knelt, ignoring the falling stones that bounced off its hardened shoulders, and reached out a hand that was now a massive, clawed gauntlet of fused bone and charred flesh. It did not attack, it initiated the final stage of the alchemical process, the conjunction, the joining of opposites. It placed its burning hand upon Al-Jaiz's chest, and the scholar felt a sensation that was beyond pain, a hideous, invasive warmth that bypassed the nerves and spoke directly to the blood. The creature was not just taking his heat now, it was taking his essence, his memories, the very pattern of his mind. As the fire consumed them both, the boundaries between the maker and the made began to dissolve, the flesh of the man melting into the flesh of the monster, a horrific fusion of intellect and instinct, of the sacred and the profane. Above ground, the ward of the paper sellers had erupted into panic, a chaotic scene of shouting men and weeping women, illuminated by the pillar of fire that punched through the street level, sending geysers of sparks into the dark sky of Baghdad. The city guard arrived, their armor clanking, shouting orders to form bucket lines, drawing water from the Tigris to fight a fire that refused to be quenched by water. They threw barrel after barrel into the smoking crater of Al-Jai's home, but the water merely hissed and evaporated before it could touch the flames, turning into scalding steam that drove the rescuers back. The smell that rose from the pit was not the smell of burning wood or paper, it was a stench that made veterans of the border wars vomit in the street, a smell of ancient musk, burning sulfur, and something shockingly biological, like a mass grave opened in the height of summer. The people whispered that Al-Jais had opened a door to the jinn, that he had been punished for his curiosity, but none of them knew the truth of what was happening beneath their feet. They did not know that the fire was not a punishment, but a cocoon. For 3 days and 3 nights, the ruins smoldered, the heat so intense that the cobblestones of the street melted into glass, sealing the cellar like a tomb. When the smoke finally cleared on the morning of the 4th day, the silence that hung over the blackened scar in the earth was absolute. The Qadi of the district, accompanied by a scribe and a team of excavators, ordered the rubble to be cleared, ostensibly to recover the body of the renowned scholar for a proper burial, but in truth, to ensure that whatever heresy had been committed there was buried forever. The workers moved the charred beams and the mountains of ash with reverence and fear, their faces wrapped in cloth to filter the lingering stench. It took them until high noon to reach the floor of the cellar, or what remained of it. What they found there would never be recorded in the official histories, it would be omitted from the biographies, whispered only in the taverns by men who would later drink themselves to death to forget. They found a body, yes, but it was not the body of a man who had died by fire or by crushing. It was a fused, twisted lump of calcified matter, a statue of agony that possessed too many limbs and a skull that was stretched and distorted beyond human proportions. The skeleton, if one could call it that, was fused into the stone floor, as if the man had melted into the earth itself. But the most terrifying detail, the one that caused the scribe to drop his tablet and flee the pit, was the position of the remains. The figure was not curled in a fetal position of protection, it was wide open, arms outstretched, and embedded in the chest cavity, fused to the ribs and the spine, was a massive, crystalline formation of silica and bone that looked suspiciously like a second, smaller skeleton absorbed into the larger one. It was a tableau of consumption, a fossilized record of a man being eaten from the outside in. And yet, there was no sign of the creature. No second body. No carcass of a beast. Only this single, horrific amalgamation and the inexplicable presence of deep, gouged claw marks in the stone walls of the cellar, marks that went up, climbing the vertical shaft toward the street, toward the open air, toward the unsuspecting world. The Qadi, a man of pragmatism and fear, ordered the pit to be filled immediately, declaring that the great Al-Jais had died when his library collapsed upon him, a tragic accident befitting a martyr of knowledge. He forbade any mention of the fused bones, the claw marks, or the smell. But a legend does not die so easily, especially one written in blood. In the years that followed the year 855, strange stories began to circulate in the intellectual circles of the Abbasid Empire. Scholars who studied the later works of Al-Jais, those texts supposedly recovered from the ruins or dictated to students in his final years, began to notice a disturbing shift in the tone. The rhetoric was sharper, colder, devoid of the human empathy that had characterized his earlier writings. The descriptions of the natural world became predatory, focusing on the cruelty of survival, the dominance of the strong over the weak, the mechanical perfection of the killer. There were rumors of a hooded figure seen in the back alleys of Baghdad at night, a figure of immense height and hulking proportions, who moved with a fluid, liquid grace that belied his size, always vanishing before he could be accosted. They said this figure visited the paper sellers, buying vast quantities of ink and parchment, paying with coins of pure gold that were centuries old, minted in the time of the ancients. And most chilling of all, there were those who claimed that if you looked closely at the margins of the surviving manuscripts of the Book of Animals, you could see faint, reddish-brown stains that looked like dried blood, and the handwriting would occasionally spasm, shifting from the elegant Arabic script of a scholar to a jagged, frantic scrawl, as if the hand holding the quill was fighting against its own muscles, or as if two minds were fighting for control of one hand. The ultimate horror of the story of Al-Jais is not that he died, but that he may have succeeded. He sought to become Al-Baari, the evolver, to create a life that could adapt and survive anything. In the end, he did not create a separate life, he became the raw material for his own evolution. The thing that climbed out of the burning cellar was not the monster, nor was it the man. It was a synthesis, a new and terrible organism that wore the memories of Al-Jais like a mask and used his genius to navigate the human world, a predator hiding in the skin of a philosopher. The body in the pit was merely the chrysalis, the cast-off shell of the transformation. The true Al-Jais, or what he had become, walked out into the world, immortal and hungry, continuing to write, continuing to observe, continuing to evolve, proving that the only true immortality is found not in paradise, but in the ruthless, unyielding will to survive at any cost. And so, when you read the history books that tell you Al-Jais was crushed by a falling pile of books, know that it is a lie agreed upon by frightened men. He was not crushed by his books, he was consumed by his ambition, and somewhere, in the dark corners of history, or perhaps in the shadows of your own room as you read this, the evolver is still watching, still learning, and still waiting for the next stage of his creation.